everyone, and good afternoon, Francois. So today we are going to have a masterclass on documentary films and the study of religions, which is organized by the Association for the Study of Religion in Southern Africa. And I'm sure many of us use documentary films in our classes and for our research. And they are an excellent resource in the study of religions. And today's masterclass, we will engage with someone who is usually behind the camera. I mean, someone who produces and creates such documentaries. And I'm going to introduce briefly today's speaker, Francois Verster. Good afternoon, and thank you again for being with us today. Francois is an Emmy-award-winning documentarian whose work has been screened at galleries and top festivals locally and globally. I mean, locally it means South Africa, and globally, right? And Francois' films titles include The Dream of Shahrazad, Sea Point Days, Girls Taken, Scenes from a Dry City. It's a long list of movies. The Mother's House, A Lion's Trail, and When the War is Over. Verster has taught at various universities, including Columbia University in New York, the University of Cape Town, at Wits, and elsewhere. And he has published in numerous journals, and he's currently convening a think tank on creative documentaries at the University of the Western Cape. He has served on various festival juries and has had 10 festival retrospectives or special focus series on his work, most recently at Indiana University, Bloomington. And in today's masterclass, he will ask the following questions. So first of all, we'll hear about what a documentary is, right? So he will enlighten us about this and what is the production of documentaries. And we are most interested in how documentary films can be used and can be a resource and a tool and a site of knowledge production within universities, and how they can expand, specifically in our case, topics which are related to the study of religions. So I will leave the floor to Francois, and we will have question and answers after his talk, and I'm very looking forward to listen to your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elisabetta, for that introduction, and thanks also to my friend Allah for inviting me to be part of the program. I think, like I guess most South Africans of my age, religion is a very central, if ongoingly negotiated part of life. So it's something that kind of keeps coming back in my life in various ways. And when you asked earlier about whether I've made films about religion, it's interesting to figure out why I have not. So obviously there's kind of an interesting sort of investigation there to be followed. But yeah, no, thanks for that. So just to introduce myself, as Elisa mentioned, my name is Francois Verster. I am what would be termed a social documentary maker, or also an independent documentary maker. I am one of two partners in a company called Undercurrent Film Television, which is more than anything a legal financial vehicle to make independent, self-originated, usually long-term creative social documentaries. Then obviously there are many different kinds of documentary film. I think when I'll be referring to documentary, I'm generally going to be speaking about social documentary. And it's also interesting to consider how we locate documentaries around religion within social documentaries. So I think traditionally, at least in kind of global North or Western programming, religion has almost taken the status, or religious programming has almost taken the status of anthropological programming, which I think is very different to the idea of social documentaries. So it'd be interesting to see how we can position that differently, or in what ways it is being positioned. So Allah asked me to speak both about the idea of documentary, or at least my own idea of documentary. I mean, documentary is a very contested and very broadly defined field. So I'm obviously going to give you a fairly personal and possibly idiosyncratic view on this, and also to speak about what might be practical steps that can be taken in order to I mean, look at the idea of using documentary in the study of religion at tertiary level. So I've divided the presentation into 4 sections. I mean, firstly, just to go over the idea of what is a documentary, and then a section looking more particularly at documentary and religion, and then more particular documentary and applications within the social sciences, and then just a couple of pointers on practical approaches. And obviously this there's no space for this to be a real filmmaking class, but I think I could probably point towards some areas of orientation that could help towards thinking about possible future films. So my notes, Allah also asked me to put everything on PowerPoint, so this might all be a little bit messy, but at least you can broadly follow what I'm speaking about. So let's start off with the idea of what a documentary actually is. I think everybody in the world has some kind of idea of what they expect a documentary to provide, and I think a lot of that is usually based on the idea the documentary either covers history, whether natural, political, geographical history, or is in some way serving a social purpose. So I think if one looks at the origins of public documentary and specifically broadcast documentary in Northern Europe in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was very much linked to education. And I think the idea of documentary as a publicly educational or a form or a medium for public improvement has quite a strong hold on the understanding of documentary publicly. I'm going to be speaking about quite different kinds of documentary, and I also think the rise or the recent rise in streamers, or the recent popularity of documentary and expanded funding for documentary on streamer channels has also shifted people's understanding of documentary quite a bit. But just to say that, yeah, documentary is a very, very widely defined and contested form. There's a lot of subjective interpretation around what it should do and what it could do, and in the way that it's used. And I think in a way that reflects the fact that documentary is an extremely open space. I mean, if you look at where documentary makers come from, they are historians, they are philosophers, they are photographers, they are gamekeepers. They are, I mean, anybody can bring any part of their life into a documentary as long as there is a link to documenting the real. I think that is what broadly defines something as documentary, but there is a kind of a link to documentation of something that happens. So in a way, it's actually the freest art form, and I think in many ways it can almost be seen as a metaphor or a model for political and artistic engagement with life. I think because of the combination of these different things. And I think also what's worth noting in this regard is that documentary almost functions as a meta montage. I mean, you probably all understand the notion of montage, how 2 images put together creates a third meaning, the classic Eisenstein idea of how meaning is produced in film by, or the, I guess the Gestalt concept of 2 images providing a third meaning. And documentary, because it's such a broad form that can contain acting and music and historical archive and sound, or whatever you want to put into it, it lends itself very well to the confluence or the juxtaposition of different systems of looking at the world. And I think that is one of the strengths, particularly within a social sciences environment, that documentary can actually straddle very different disciplines and cross many borders fairly easily. For those of you that are interested, there is a what is, I guess, termed a modern classic of international documentary. It's a Chilean filmmaker, Patricio Guzman's Nostalgia for the Light. For those of you that haven't seen it, the film explicitly ties together the search for undiscovered stars in an observatory in the desert in Chile. So basically looking towards the past, this is light emanating from billions of years ago. It ties it together with a group of women looking for their disappeared brothers and sisters and sons and so on. So it's this kind of meditation on history that uses very, very different stories in order, and it also goes into archaeology and a whole lot of other lines, but it very consciously brings together a number of different lines and different disciplines within the one form. So documentary is to some degree exactly defined by paradoxes and tensions, and I've listed some of them here that you can go through. I mean, between art and fact, between interpretation and representation, between subjectivity and integrity, between reportage and its philosophical uses, between authenticity and political commitment, between randomness and order, chaos and structure, the needs of characters and the needs of the director, between immediacy, filming in the moment, and reflection on what's been filmed, between the structural lines of emotion, theme, chronology, and narrative. Usually when people speak about documentary, they speak about reality, they speak about truth, and they speak about objectivity. All these terms are very problematic. I mean, I think we all know the problems with kind of claims to realism and the, I guess, political or hegemonic dimensions to traditions of realism. And obviously, within a situation where a filmmaker is making choices in the filming and the editing and the music, there is no such thing as an objective truth. Filmmakers often speak about authenticity. I think that is obviously, if you follow Adorno and other theorists, that is also a problematic term, and possibly the better I guess term to use might be integrity or personal integrity in relation to one's own understanding or one's own position, or personal truth, if you want to call it that. The most famous definition of documentary is probably the one by John Grierson, who's called it the creative treatment of actuality. And I think what's interesting there is that he uses the word creative treatment. It's not just a kind of a representation, it is a personal, interpretative treatment and of actuality. He doesn't use the word reality. So I suppose he invokes the idea of things that actually happened, which is not necessarily the same as how we understand realism in audiovisual terms. And then just a couple of quotes just that inspire me in terms of, have inspired me in terms of how I understand documentary. One is from the Swiss documentary filmmaker Peter Lichty, who said that the problem with documentaries is that audiences see them as a real truth. And the bigger problem is that the directors often do too. So I think that's just a kind of a challenge to the idea of documentary, kind of having an objective truth. And then also I added the line from Francois Truffaut, who said that the camera should only record that which the human eye cannot see. Now, that's obviously a slightly pretentious comment to make, but I think the idea is that the role of the camera is to interpret. The role of the camera is to frame and draw attention and focus on things in ways that the normal eye doesn't look at. So I think often the strength of at least an observational filmmaker or documentary observational filmmaker is to find elements in a frame or find elements in a situation that somehow define or say more about what's going on. So to see the things that sort of the casual observer in the situation might not see. And then one more quote from the German filmmaker Werner Herzog. I mean, he does not believe in observation, the idea of cinema verite or holding up a camera telling the truth. He believes that documentary films should manipulate the truth, that you can only reach or manipulate what is being recorded, and that you can only find the truth through conscious manipulation of reality as you have experienced it. So he says cinema verite confounds facts and truth. Facts create norms and truth illumination. There are deeper strata of truth in cinema, and there's such a thing as poetic, ecstatic truth. It is mysterious and elusive, and can be reached only through fabrication and imagination and stylization. So obviously you can see the kind of religiously discursive overtones in this. And I think the idea that truth depends on fabrication and imagination and stylization takes it very much outside of notions of the real. And then if we conceive of religion as the not real, or not sort of humanly real, at least, it's interesting then to start thinking about how does at least somebody like Werner Herzog's idea of documentary fit into that. So perhaps it's easiest to try to define documentary by what it is not. I think, first of all, we are speaking about what we could, again, possibly in a slightly pretentious way called creative documentary. But the idea is that, kind of documentaries that are not sort of slotted or cannot be slotted into a kind of clear TV format. It's not done according to clear TV roles. So it's usually kind of longer term forms that lead with insight rather than information and look at experience rather than fact and so on. So traditionally when one applied for funding in, say, Scandinavian countries, there was a film institute, a government-funded film institute that was set up explicitly for the idea of funding creative documentary, as opposed to television funding, which would then fund the kind of films or the programs that one would see on television. Obviously, the other way of defining documentary is in relation to fiction. The borderline between documentary and fiction has never quite been certain, never quite been clear, and it's a subject of endless ongoing debate and theorization. I mean, I personally believe that there is a distinction. Some people believe there's not. The American filmmaker Errol Morris, you might have seen his film, The Thin Blue Line, and so on, had a very interesting line to the effect of saying that for him, the most effective or the most powerful creative documentaries are always theorizing the line between fiction and documentary. So it's always documentary by pushing the creative sort of artistic element is always challenging its own relationship to fiction, probably exactly because fiction usually is aligned with those kind of more creative forms. On the other hand, you have somebody like the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who has written about documentary as being a politically limitless form, a form of limitless possibility, exactly because he believes that documentary is freed from the political regimes of fiction. So in a sense, he believes that the narrative conventions of fiction are far more driven by political regimes or market regimes, as opposed to documentary, which is not so strictly tied to the same kind of structures and therefore has a lot more political agency or a lot more possibility of political, I guess, progressive political inspiration or change, as it were. I think there's also, as I've mentioned earlier, there's a sense that documentary, or at least creative social documentary, is different from visual anthropology, it's different from history films. I think the classic history film that one sees on television often is quite fairly or quite squarely based in the past without much sort of direct application to the present. Whereas on the other hand, a creative film such as Raoul Peck's film James Baldwin, I'm Not Your Negro, which I'm sure many of you have seen, it's a film that's recorded in the past, but everything speaks directly to the present. So I think the idea is also that social documentary or creative documentary is not safe. It's not one of these armchair sort of experiences that things are very easily elsewhere or very easily in the past. So there's two models that I like to use when speaking about documentary generally. The first one is that documentary exists in what I see as a triangular relationship between art on the one corner, politics or political point of view on the other corner, and then reality as recorded in the third corners. And art, politics, and reality, in a sense, always sit in a tension. I mean, it's a tension that is generative. It's a tension that's constantly being negotiated by the filmmaker. And I think the way in which that tension is negotiated is often exactly what gives a particular documentary film its voice. The second model is a continuum between, on the one hand, exploration and on the other hand, communication. So if one thinks of some fiction-based films are purely based on communication, I think one could probably speak about propaganda films, for example, or training films, a film that tells you, or maybe shows you how to boil an egg or change a car wheel or construct a chair or whatever the case might be. I mean, the information is cardinal. Whereas on the other hand, you have films that do not convey information. They explore, they test reality, they test the interaction of an aesthetic approach with reality, and so on and so on. And they often have to do with the filmmaker going in and asking a question rather than having an answer. So often social documentary, at least in the form we're speaking about here, is on much more on the side of exploration. When for in my own case, for example, I like to think that I make films because they explore the world, they ask questions, they raise questions, they complicate the world. They don't, I mean, I cannot quite conceive of it, for my own case at least, I cannot quite conceive of making a film that directly sets out to communicate a specific thing. And I mean, that's probably in some way related to my own life situation and experiences, but that is my own approach to documentary. So another element that's really, really important, and I think particularly when we speak about religion or religious documentaries becomes even more important, is the interrelationships of the point of view of the filmmaker, the character, and the audience. So I think in more, what is for me more interesting social documentaries, you realize that there's a kind of an interaction or interplay between the point of view of the filmmaker and the point of view of the characters. The relationship often changes from one thing into something else. Often the point of view of one side is temporarily undermined or questioned or then relocated. And I think this game of point of view perspectives, it's also identifying how it works as an extremely powerful tool for understanding how documentary functions. So for me, again, personally, if you look at films where the point of view of the character and the point of view of the subject either completely align or are completely opposed, the films are a lot less interesting. So an example of a film where the point of view is completely aligned is something like David Guggenheim's An Inconvenient Truth, the film about Al Gore, where basically the film simply endorses everything that Al Gore says on stage, and the film, in a sense, is kind of a replication of Al Gore's lectures. So there's no real space for engagement or questioning or for kind of, looking at it from a different angle. On the other hand, if you have films that are takedowns that just go out right from the beginning to show how bad a specific person or, force or society or whatever is, I think they're similarly less interesting. An example for me would be something like Alex Gibney's film on actually, that's an interesting film about religion. It's a film about L. Ron Hubbard. And basically, he, in Dianetics, he takes down Scientology completely. There's no moment of not being antagonistic towards the subject. And I think those kind of films are much less interesting and ultimately much less powerful and useful than films that do try to sort of negotiate the complexity of point of view and the complexity of reality. I think the recent move towards impact film, I mean, that's kind of a catchword in documentary, where films are funded on the basis of kind of concrete outcomes where they will change laws or change, I don't know, people's or public policy on specific things, which, I mean, obviously it's important to do that, but I think funding for documentary has very, very much shifted towards that, largely because of the quantifiable or quantifiability of it. And I think the problem with that is that, again, there is a uniform coincidence of filmmaker and subject point of view, which, and I think often misses the reality and or the layerness of reality, and finally amounts to a kind of untruth. Okay, then just quickly a couple of other points. I think one of the amazing things about documentary is exactly the fact that it is generous and that it is generative. I think those two things are linked. I think this is also why, in my mind, it is so applicable to the social sciences research, and possibly, depending on one's view on religion, to religion as well. The idea that an engagement with either a text, either the documentary itself or the kind of reality or event or actuality that the documentary addresses, as a space of generation and a space of new possibility. Documentary also has a very peculiar relationship to authorship. The filmmaker is both in control and not at all. And I think part of the problem with analyzing documentaries, academically and or in public media or as well, critical public media, is often a kind of an over-assignment of authorial intention, because the author obviously does decide on the story and the content and so on, but at the same time, the author is also reliant on reality or facts as it unfolds. So the story is still subject to factual truth in the very broadest sense. And then again, in post-structuralist terms, documentary is intertextual. It is heavily reliant on experiences or the self-writing of its subjects. So it's never sort of, or it's very explicitly not originated in the deepest sense by the filmmaker. My own sense is that it's better, and it's more useful to look at authorship as a point of view issue than as a control issue. But I mean, that's something we can speak about further. And then I just noted the approach of documentary as what I call an aesthetics of insecurity. I think it's very, very useful for a documentary maker, while being prepared and doing due research, is to embrace the idea of not knowing, to question their own positionality or even the positionality as offered by the subjects. And I think with this also comes a level of ethical insecurity as well. I mean, there is a sense in which documentary is not safe. It's a dangerous area. It's an area of transgression. And I think we can bring that also into the discussion around how we look at religion. So, and related to that, I think the one of the ideas we've been developing in the group or the class I teach at UWC is the idea of looking at one's own material as found fragments. So the idea is that the author is also a text, the author is also a record. So if I go film something at a specific point in time, the way I film it, the way I approach it is also a historical record. So if one manages to have that kind of distance, at least in the edit, to be able to read one's own positionality or one's own process critically, I think it becomes another valuable document. This is different for me from the standard or traditional anthropological techniques of kind of self-reflexivity, referencing the presence of the filmmaker. I think often, in my experience, the less well-made anthropological films tend to recenter the filmmaker at the expense of the subject, with the result that one actually learns less, and it's often counterproductive in my mind. So I think documentary is partly about how subjectivity can be acknowledged without recentering the author. So let's move on to documentary and religion. I'd like to start or find an entry point into this through looking at the idea of documentary as art. I personally have probably a kind of a 19th century style approach to the idea of a religion of art, which is, obviously something I've interrogated a lot, but it somehow feeds into my kind of relationship or my need to make documentary films. This is a contested relationship. There's a lot of arguments people make against saying documentary should not be seen as an art form, and there's obviously a lot of historical ongoing debates for hundreds of years around what actually constitutes art. But in documentary, at least popularly, I think the element of art, okay, it's not a quantifiable element, but it is an element that separates documentary film from impact film, streamers, and so on. And I think also the historical idea for me that is valid here is that art lies in the unplanned, the unknowable, the uncontained, that which exceeds normal life experience and makes sense of the world in new ways. So in documentary, art appears where the film exceeds what is expected, or when the materials of reality are put together in such a way that there are new openings for emotion, insight, political understanding, human connection, spiritual connectedness. So a space where understanding of reality can be contested, expanded, and brought into relation with new other realities, emotions, and understanding. So I think core to this is the idea of irreducibility, which again clearly has links to certain ideas of religion or certain conceptions of religiosity. I think what we could call the will to enchantment in art, I think this is something that is popularly associated with art, is also in some way parallel to a will for belief. Now, I have a quotation here from Jane Coetzee's book, Elizabeth Costello, where the main character's sister, who is a nun working in a rural orphanage, says that, or argues that European humanities, the humanities or studies of humanities as we know them, historically lost their way once textual scholarship stopped focusing on understanding the Bible as the redemptive word. So her argument is basically that once scholars stopped trying to reach for a definite truth through the word of God that had been revealed, there was no real function for it. It became an arid, self-referential form. So documentary as a form, is broadly framed by an Enlightenment discourse. It is about truth and about objectivity and all these things traditionally. But at the same time, I would argue that it still reflects the ongoing whole of the notion of belief, or maybe of Platonic closure, in that it has a retained adherence to the possibility of truth, of realism, of solutions for the world. So when then in creative documentary, the impossibility of these things are acknowledged, but at the same time, the pursuit continues, I think such a kind of a paradox then brings us closer to the study, both the study and the practice of religion. The idea of, in simple terms, the idea of belief, the idea that this is an impossible quest, but one continues because it is all that you have, or it is the process by which you live, or the guidelines by which you live. And I think in some ways we can link this to kind of a growing frustration with political and aesthetic manifestation of Western style rationalism as a tool of liberalist ideology. I think we see that kind of thing when you read Christopher Hitchens criticizing, kind of religion, or people speaking about the unconquerable divide between East and West and all these kind of things, which is often based in religious terms. And I think, and also that is in many ways sort of manifested through a scientific rationalism, and then in documentary terms through the communication of supposedly objective facts. So there has been a kind of quite strong, universal move towards other ways, or I guess sort of different aesthetic manifestations of documentary in the way it deals with reality. So one famously cryptic statement, which some of you probably know, by the philosopher Theodor Adorno, could well be a constructive starting point for practitioners of humanities and documentary filmmakers alike. And he wrote that the only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in the face of despair is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Knowledge has no light but that shed on the world by redemption, all else is reconstruction, mere technique. Perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. So that's obviously a heavily religiously influenced kind of look at, reality from a very, I guess at base, very strongly Marxist sociologist, philosopher. I think there's also, from that, I think we can also glean that there's a parallel with the idea of the existing structure, knowledge and fact being in dialectic with interpretation. And this perhaps echoes debates. I'm not a religious scholar, but as I understand, debates between views on religion. On the one hand, I guess stricter defined, or more broadly socially defined, established reiterative and delineating forms of religion as, having specific rules, as a specific communal experience, versus, as I understand it, William James and other early modernist thinkers trying to argue for religion as an intrinsically subjective rather than as a communal experience. And I think, again, one can also draw a parallel with documentary, in a sense, negotiating its very powerful, kind of partly objective societal basis, as well as universal impact of technology on form and meaning. So there are so-called, or I guess broadly, powerful non-individual elements that sort of are then also negotiated in the space of making documentary. So to get to making films on religious subjects, let's ask why and what would we do? Do we document religious practices, the context of these practices, the history of certain religious practices or religions, or broadly religious and associated moral views? Do we try to document subjects' inner experiences? Do we try to suggest or emulate or recreate religious experience? Do we simply try to expand theological debates? There was a Danish filmmaker called John Bang Carlsen who, for example, made a film in Poulsma prison where he called it The Portrait of God. And it was basically conversations with prisoners about who and what God is. Or should the film itself, in a way, function as a religious text or a religious instrument? I think it's also important to look at how we can avoid the pitfalls of classical anthropology. Kind of, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of framing of religion as other, the kind of categorizing people according to certain sort of, I guess, broadly religious identities. There's a kind of a reification of religion into a specific value. I think you really very often see that in films made by outsiders in the so-called Middle East. I think the kind of category, as Zizek would speak of tolerance, where religions are tolerated according to liberalist multiculturalist lines, is also problematic. Or simply the idea that religion is assessed from a rational or over-rational and usually Western point of view. I mean, I was at a conference at the CHIC or a conference at the castle a couple of years ago, and there was a scholar from India who basically said that he finds it very weird that everybody is speaking about a post-religious era and the death of God and everything, when in his country 90% of people, I don't know what figure he gave, are, kind of have religion as a very active part of their daily life in a population of 1 billion people. So it's obviously that idea of a post-religious world is very much a kind of historically or geographically specific concept. Okay, so obviously in this, if we look at religious programs on TV, I mean, I think they run the same risks. I mean, obviously when a SAC series such as Issues of Faith came out, it was done within the context of kind of nation building and the Rainbow Nation and the variety of South Africans and all that. And I'm sure it probably served that, but also it served to entrench the kind of problematic slotting of multiculturalism, which a lot of the other projects at the time entailed. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's noticeable that films about religion are often made by outsiders. So if I have a chance, I'll show you a clip by somebody made from the outside and then somebody partly from the inside. So if we do have a bunch for that. Okay, so an interesting text that I would recommend anybody interested in looking at films or cinema's possibly religious or transcendental qualities, if you want to use the word, and which also takes that debate onto the level of the linguistic text itself, is Nathaniel Dorsky's Devotional Cinema. So he is a so-called experimental filmmaker who's had a lifelong obsession with the relationship between religion and cinema. And he explores spaces in the book. It's a short book. It's a very easy read. It was actually 2 lectures turned into a book. But he explores spaces where film, and I quote, where film itself is a spirit of experience of religion. He writes about how people take different approaches to this, and he writes, the respect for the ineffable is an essential aspect of devotion. It is fear of direct contact with the uncontrollable present that motivates the flight into concept. The filmmaker seeks the safety net of an idea or something to accomplish that is already known. And I think, again, we can bring that very directly to documentaries in the sense that an engagement with an uncontrollable present is, yeah, it has to do with the ineffable. I mean, there is a kind of idea of reading the unreadable or reading the as yet understandable or engaging with it, which again has, at least in my conception of religion, very strong links. And important with this book is that he tries to find a verbal language that doesn't reduce experience through analysis. It's more kind of a companion piece. And this is extremely relevant to how we look at documentary, particularly if we're looking at documentaries about religious experience, because I think if we are going to just simply record religious experience on camera, it can often be a very powerfully othering experience. And I think there's a lot, I mean, a lot of thinking can be done about that. Okay, so I don't know if we're running out of time, but I'll go on. Just stop me if you want to move on to questions. But just to speak a bit more about documentary in the social sciences, the relationship between theory and aesthetic practice is very complex. And it has been the pursuit of the program at the Center for Humanities Research that I've been convening since 2014. Probably the main idea there has been to encourage postgraduate students, postdoc fellows, and staff to add a audiovisual dimension to their existing research. So participants in the group have been encouraged to try to take the research they've done or the research questions that they're dealing with and try to see how they play out when explored within audiovisual form. So obviously filmmaking and academic research are not two clearly separable delineated pursuits. Both involve research, creativity, and asking questions about the world we live in. And then the notion of practice-based research also challenges established ideas in curriculum and output. So should artistic practice primarily be a mode of research, or should it rather be aimed towards concrete, publicly consumable outcomes? And then this question obviously becomes permanent when raised in the context of a place like University of the Western Cape, historically Black university in South Africa, where the universities have often been ghettoized as job training institutions rather than being allowed space for independent thought and speculation in the world. So what we've tried to do at the CHR with the film program is to find a balance between, I guess, film as output, as a product, if you want to use that word, and very extensive experimentation or thought through film. So some of the work being done is only showed in the class. Some of it is, has shown at festivals. Some of them actually won awards at festivals. We also now entering a relationship with Cape Town Television, where they'll be showing films that were made in the documentary film program. But I think the important thing is that there is a room for experimentation, which the tertiary university space is very uniquely valuable towards, because I mean there's a space to get things wrong, there's a space to ask questions without knowing whether there will be answers. So there's not the pressures of the commercial filmmaking world, which I think is obviously completely applicable to religious studies at UCT as well. So I was going to speak about a couple of examples from the CHR program, but we're going to run out of time. Okay, so in the films being put out, there's a continuum between films where the aesthetic creative decisions are decided strictly on the basis of theoretical understanding of form, and films that are more openly explorative. So we've had filmmakers like Damietta Torlasco from Chicago showing and discussing her films, and the films, every single cut is theorized, and every single I guess creative decision is there in a way that can be explained and, I suppose, to a degree defended, as opposed to films that take a much more openly explorative and less controlled basis. So I think all these different kind of films are very much possible within the tertiary environment. But I think the core idea here for me is that of possibility, of generation, of generativity. And I think, I mean, if we look at the project of decolonization over the past number of years, I mean, it's not just about removing what was, it is also about what is possible. And I think this is where documentary directly feeds into the spirit, where, you know, there's a way in which radical new possibilities can be explored through film. And it's not only in the form itself, but also, I think, in relation to how creative work is positioned and valued in the, as an alternative site of knowledge within the tertiary environment. So as I understand it, a lot of the move towards practice, so-called practice-based research, is also based in debates that came out of, you know, kind of, yeah, the decolonization movement. So first of all, if we are doing, or apart from, I guess, creative, you know, output in the, you know, in research areas, there's also the pure value, simple value of documentation for social research purposes. I mean, you know, if you form something, you have a historical record. The moment you've clicked the on button, something is historical. You have a record of something that happened at a specific point in time. So it has a archival or pure crude archival value in that sense. Which then also gives you the possibility of an ever-evolving future analysis and reinterpretation. I mean, what's interesting for me is how documentary, or the documentation aspect of documentary, is often undervalued, in the sense that one looks at films that were made, say, in Africa in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and they're deeply problematic, you know, representationally, or in the structure, or even in the way people are filmed. But at the same time, there is a level of a reality of that time and a human reality that comes through despite the control or the intention of the filmmaker. So I think there's a great value purely in the fact of documentation. I mean, there's also, if as a social science researcher one is entering a situation, a film also allows a emotional or maybe even spiritual dimension of engaging with the situation. I mean, there's other elements that come to the fore that one might not think about or might not be focusing on when writing, or strictly writing in a verbal language. And then, as argued before, the filming also becomes a register of the researcher's own point of view, sensibility, understanding, so that the researcher themselves become a potential locus for analysis at a later point. And then, of course, as mentioned, there's also, you know, the document can then also be the basis of unlimited further creation. I mean, Tolkien, just to end that off, Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer, spoke about the creation of imaginary worlds as the highest human calling. So it's almost a kind of a religious endorsement of the human as a creator alongside God. So I think that's something that I can also link to religious studies. Shall we stop there, or shall I mention a few practical things, or should we stop there?
Francois, we have actually, I wanted to give a little bit of time to the floor, I mean, to ask questions, and maybe you can wrap it up in a few minutes. Yeah.
I was just going to mention, I mean, a couple of, I mean, just because Ella asked about sort of practical pointers, but I think if just in terms of participants in the group, or more broadly, wanting to think about making films, I think the most important thing to note or to focus on is tailoring the work to existing limitations. So look at what is available in terms of sound, camera, edit gear, finances, time, your physical or social access to the subject, you know, what the curriculum advise, what the stipulations of the university are, and, you know, kind of, and I would say, try to tailor whatever you do according to those. Don't try to do something, don't try to make a Netflix $3 million budget when you are, you know, living on a 200,000 rand a year stipend. And also, I think the other important thing is to try to keep things open. You know, don't necessarily push for a concrete outcome, exactly because I think the tertiary environment does allow for many different ways of using footage that maybe are not available in the, I guess, the formal documentary industry. So I think I'll leave it at those two thoughts for now.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And now I would like to, I have a questions or two, but first of all, I would like to give the floor to see if there is anyone who can want to ask questions. You can either, I don't know, Ala, maybe you can help me here, because I don't know if I see hands.
No, I'm not seeing any hand.
Okay.
I also have a small question, but after you, bro.
All right, thank you. So I was very interested in the part with regard to control and viewpoint that you mentioned before, Francois, with regard to the viewer and the author, right? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on it, in the sense of, the way as a viewer, the way that I see documentaries or documentary film, is that so there is quite a lot of control of by the author during the production and during the creation of the movie. And then probably the control is still there, but somehow it passes, I mean, through the viewpoint, so to say, threshold once it's produced, and once is so the viewer is engaging with the documentary. But I don't know if this is something that you had in mind when you were talking about control and viewpoint issues, or is it something different?
Well, I think I mean, there's very many different kinds of documentaries. I think if you look at films on the History Channel, or you look at, I guess, a lot of the higher end Netflix originated, kind of Netflix original documentaries, I think they are made in a very tightly scripted, very controlled manner. And often with those films, the script will be decided on the basis of research done before. And, in a sense, the filmmaker would almost be, kind of coloring in by numbers. They'd be filling in the gaps because they know what they're going to get. I mean, that is for me a completely alien way of working. I mean, we made one film recently that was very interview based, and we broadly knew what people were going to say because we'd known them for a couple of years. But I mean, still within that, a lot of unexpected things happen. I mean, I think for me personally, I guess the kind of documentaries I've been referring to are not that controlled in the process. I think, I mean, I think documentaries where unexpected things happen are often the ones where, I mean, not only for the audience, but also for the film, or more so for the filmmaker, are the films that we often find most exciting. Because I think there's also a form of, I think it's also about engagement. I mean, there's a form of engagement with films that are not as tightly controlled, which gives for a very, very different viewing experience. And I think for me, that's, again, within the trajectory or the continuum towards religious experiences, maybe closer, because it's not a circumscribed, it's an open experience. And what I try to do, at least in my own films, I mean, obviously you are guiding the experience, but the idea is that you create spaces for people to have a kind of emotional reaction on their own terms to some degree. I mean, that you're not banging them over the head, telling them what to think. I mean, you are giving them a space where as open-ended as possible, a space while also guiding them at some level. So, and then what I can also add is that I mean, for me, the idea of exploration is most important. And the exploration doesn't only happen in the research, it very, very much, particularly when you're doing observational film, happens during the filming. I mean, I often do a lot of people do very thorough research. I tend to do relatively little research. I mean, I feel my research is the filming. I understand something as I'm filming, I discover it as I'm filming. But then often one only understands what one is doing once you get to the edit. I mean, a lot of filmmakers would tell you that they actually only understand what is in the material once they can put all the different parts together, and they can see how this event filmed 2 years ago links to this event and why that person had that facial reaction and so on and so on. But then interestingly is that the process of exploration doesn't stop when the film is finished. It actually continues when the film is released. And I think, again, depending on the kind of film, but for me, it's almost once I finish the film, I'm no longer in control of its meaning. And then it always fascinates me to see what kind of other meanings that I did not intend that the film ends up having. I mean, I'm not, that's what I say. So the author is not, it's not God. I mean, the author, I mean, I think there's, as I mentioned, there's a kind of a over attribution of agency to the author, at least for certain kinds of documentary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was also, you know, when you were talking, also sort of my view of, you know, the also power relationship, so to say, right, between the author and also the people who are doing the, you know, interview. You are interviewing them, so which also reminds, you know, the relationship between when you do field work between the interviewer and the interviewees. So when you give them with regard to, for example, open questions, interviews or biographical interviews, so you give them space and you only guide them, you know, but then this is the editing, and then the interpretation of what they've said that then goes into the paper, right? So your agency is still there. And also with regard to documentary, where you were saying, so it's the editing and then the montage also, right? That is creating the end product, where you still have control over the product up to the point of finalizing it, isn't it?
I would probably phrase it as you discover increasingly how much less control you have than you think you have, because things surprise you all the time. And I think it's also to do with I mean, I guess what I mentioned about an aesthetics of openness or ethics of openness or insecurity, that I think, you know, you will obviously get things wrong, and people are, I mean, when you're making a film, people are putting their lives in your hand for, I mean, in some way, you know, it's immense responsibility. And you have people like the Georgian Russian filmmaker Sergei Dvortsvoy, was kind of seen as one of the modern documentary greats. He actually stopped making documentary for that reason. He felt that he had too much power and he didn't feel he was playing God. But I think, I mean, you know, there are, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, but there are, I mean, I think documentary is fundamentally a immoral or a morally challenging form. I mean, it is a transgressive form, it is a dangerous form, and I think the best you can do is to you know, work as honestly and with as much integrity and as respectfully as you can with the material. And I think, you know, obviously you want your subjects to also be okay with the film. So I mean, I always, you know, I mean, there's, in my case, I mean, there's always a sort of, if there's income from the film after completion, it's always shared with the characters. That's one thing. But the other thing is also, I mean, I always make sure that they are, you know, they might not like everything about the film, but that they feel it's a fair film, or that it's sort of not a false portrayal. So I mean, I like to go from the standpoint that I can face an audience with the character there, and it's okay. I mean, I can stand up next to them and they feel respectfully treated. There's a massive move now around the world towards collaborative filmmaking. Probably echoes, I guess, broader tendencies in the social sciences and humanities as well. I'm not sure if that solves the problems always. I mean, there's very different ways of doing it, but I think it creates a whole lot of other problems as well. And I don't think it's, I mean, when you look at films made collaboratively, I think it often diminishes at least certain aspects, even though there's a kind of endorsement. But it also has to do with agency and understanding of self. And I guess my approach is that nobody is in control of reality, and you know, I think it's not possible to fix that control. I mean, obviously, I mean, you have to work with people's needs and respect people and whatever they need. So I think that's the best you can do.
Sure, thank you. Hala?
My question very much following up in this discussion, one of your definition of documentary, which you showed us on the PowerPoint, is that documentary, it's a representation of the actual, but not the real. So I wonder what is the real difference between the real, is the not the representation of reality, but of the actuality. So if documentary is not a representation of reality, to which extent then it is a fabrication of reality? And this is, I want to relate my question to your discussion. One of the red flag in social science, it have been the subjectivity of the author and the extent to which the subjectivity is overt in the text that somehow create a question mark about the text. So how can we deal with the subjectivity of the filmmaker? In which way we could manage or filter the subjectivity of the filmmaker? And again, to which extent he is really representing reality and not making reality for whatever interest in his mind?
I mean, what you're asking there is basically the cardinal question around documentary as a whole. I mean, because it is a photorealistic form, but the idea of photorealism is historically and technologically inscribed and comes with a whole sort of set of associations and values and presumptions and philosophical and political weight. So, I mean, my approach is just that, and this is again trying to distinguish, I guess, creative documentary from, kind of TV programming, is that documentary is subjective. It's a kind of a given. And I think this is not even, I almost feel, and when people speak about including the filmmaker in the film, obviously that makes you aware of the fact that there's a filmmaker there, but that's still in some way based in a notion of realism. It's still sort of, I don't know if it solves the kind of bigger problems around realism or whether it actually adds that much. And this is, for me, the admission of, or the intrusion of subjectivity in by aesthetic means is much more interesting. There's a kind of so this is what makes creative documentary for me so interesting, because the fact of a kind of a creative interpretation is a de facto or a very straightforward admission of a subjective point of view, I think. And it's just that the admission is made on aesthetic rather than in photorealist or audio, kind of audio realist, whatever the term is termed. So, for me, subjectivity is something to be embraced and not to, I think the pretense to objectivity is more of a problem.
Thank you.
This is a long, discussion with regard to subjectivity, objectivity in the study of religions, the idea of the scholar being neutral or not being neutral. So this is something that we can continue for hours, to discuss. However, unfortunately, our time's up today. And I don't know if there are maybe one more question, if there is anyone who would like to ask a question to Francois. If not, Ala and Francois, I think we should close the session here. And Francois, many thanks again. And I hope we'll continue our discussion.
Yeah, I'd be very interested.
At the university, yeah.
I'd be very interested to see what films come out, or what kind of topics or what kind of approaches people end up following in the department.
All right. Thank you so much again. And see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.